Harrison Ford stepped out of an unmarked car and walked into a modest funeral home in 1982, his head bowed, his hands shaking, while every mourner inside turned and stared at the stranger who looked exactly like Indiana Jones. He sat in the back row, wept silently through the entire service, and when the deceased's family approached him afterward, he squeezed their hands, whispered something no one else could hear, and disappeared. Harrison Ford's knuckles were white on the steering wheel. His rental car pulled over on a dirt road outside San Bernardino, California, and he was staring at a cemetery he had no business being anywhere near. His jaw was clamped so tight you could see the muscles working under his skin, and he hadn't moved from that driver's seat in 11 minutes. What happened in the next 3 hours would become one of Hollywood's strangest secrets, a story whispered about for decades. Because Harrison Ford, the biggest movie star on the planet in the summer of 1982, was about to walk into a funeral for a man he had supposedly never met, and for 30 years, not a single person would know why. Now I need to back up. Not far, just enough so you understand what was at stake. It's June of 1982. Raiders of the Lost Ark came out the year before and turned Harrison Ford from that guy in Star Wars into a genuine, no-questions-asked leading man. He's about to start filming Return of the Jedi. Blade Runner just hit theaters. The man is everywhere. Magazine covers, talk shows, lunchboxes. He can't walk into a gas station without someone asking him to sign a napkin. And here's the thing about Harrison Ford in 1982 that people forget. He wasn't comfortable with any of it. He didn't want the fame. He wanted the work. He'd spent years as a carpenter in Los Angeles, building cabinets for people's kitchens, picking up small acting roles when he could get them. He'd clawed his way to the top with sawdust still under his fingernails, and now the world wanted a piece of him every single day. Believe me, that matters for what comes next. The funeral was for a man named Raymond Earl Harris, 63 years old, retired machinist, lived in a small house in Rialto, California, a working-class town where nobody drove anything flashy and nobody knew anybody famous. Raymond had died of a heart attack on a Tuesday afternoon while watering his front lawn. His wife, Dolores, found him face down in the grass with the hose still running. They'd been married 41 years. He left behind Dolores, 2 grown sons, a daughter, and 7 grandchildren. A regular man, an ordinary life. The kind of funeral where maybe 30 people show up, everyone wears something a little too old, and the pastor mispronounces the deceased's middle name. So when a tall man in sunglasses and a dark sport coat stepped out of a rented sedan and walked through the cemetery gates that Thursday morning, people noticed, not because they recognized him right away, but because he didn't belong. He moved differently. He walked with that rangy, deliberate stride like a man used to knowing exactly where his body was at all times, and he was alone. No wife, no friend, no assistant, just him, a pair of aviator sunglasses, and a face that was starting to look very, very familiar to the people gathered around Raymond Harris's grave. Get this. It was Raymond's 12-year-old granddaughter, Michelle, who figured it out first. She tugged on her mother's sleeve and whispered something. Her mother, Linda, looked up. Her eyes went wide. She grabbed her brother Tommy's arm. Tommy turned around. And now 3 members of the Harris family were staring at this stranger standing about 40 feet from the grave, his hands clasped in front of him, his head slightly bowed. Tommy Harris was 34 years old, built thick from construction work and protective of his family the way you'd expect from the oldest son. He broke away from the group and walked straight toward the stranger. His fists weren't clenched, but they weren't relaxed either. He stopped about 6 feet away. "Can I help you?" Harrison Ford took off his sunglasses, and Tommy Harris's face went through about 4 expressions in 2 seconds. "I'm sorry to intrude," Ford said. "I'm here to pay my respects to your father." Tommy didn't move. His boots were planted in the grass and his chin was up. "You knew my dad?" Ford paused. That pause would become important later. He looked past Tommy toward the casket, toward the flowers, toward the small crowd of ordinary people in their ordinary clothes grieving an ordinary man. Then he looked back at Tommy. "I did. Can I explain after the service?" Now here's where it gets interesting. Tommy Harris had every right to tell this man to leave. This was his father's funeral. This was private. This was family. But something in Ford's face, something in the way he asked, made Tommy take a half step back. He nodded once. "Stay near the back," he said, and he walked back to his family. Ford put his sunglasses back on. He stayed near the back, and for the next 40 minutes, one of the most famous actors in the world stood silently among strangers, listening to a pastor talk about a retired machinist from Rialto who liked fishing, hated asparagus, and never once missed a Sunday dinner with his family. Here's what nobody tells you about funerals. They're not really for the dead. They're for the living. They're for the people standing there trying to figure out how the world keeps spinning when someone they love just stopped. And every person at that funeral was doing exactly that, trying to hold it together, trying to make sense of the hole that Raymond Harris had left behind. Except now they also had to make sense of why Indiana Jones was standing in the back row. The service ended. People started moving toward their cars. A few of the grandchildren were crying. Dolores Harris, Raymond's widow, was being held up by her daughter Linda, walking slowly across the grass with the careful steps of a woman whose whole world had just tilted sideways. And Harrison Ford didn't leave. He stood there, waiting. Tommy came back over to him. This time his wife was with him, a woman named Patricia, who had sharper eyes than Tommy and less patience. She folded her arms. "All right," Tommy said. "The service is over. You said you'd explain." Ford reached into the inside pocket of his sport coat. He pulled out an envelope. It was old, not ancient but worn, the kind of envelope that had been opened and refolded several times. He held it out to Tommy. "Your father wrote me this letter 8 years ago." Tommy took the envelope. He looked at it. His brow creased. He pulled out the letter inside, and Patricia leaned in to read it over his shoulder. "I swear this happened. What was in that letter is the reason this story exists, and we'll get to every word of it. But first, you need to understand what was happening in Harrison Ford's life 8 years before this funeral, because that's where the whole thing starts. 1974. Harrison Ford was nobody. I mean that with respect, but it's the truth. He was a 32-year-old carpenter and part-time actor who'd had a few tiny roles in movies and TV shows that nobody remembered. He'd been in American Graffiti the year before, a small part that got him some attention, but not enough to pay the bills. He was married to his first wife, Mary. They had 2 young sons, and he was spending most of his days doing carpentry work around Los Angeles to keep the lights on. He'd built a recording studio for Sergio Mendes. He'd installed a sun porch for Sally Kellerman. He was good with his hands, meticulous, the kind of carpenter who measured everything 3 times. But every night he'd come home with sawdust in his hair and a question in his gut. Was he fooling himself? Was acting ever going to work? Was he wasting his family's time chasing something that was never going to happen? He'd been asking himself that question for 10 years by that point. A decade of auditions, rejections, tiny parts, and long silences. His agents had dropped him, twice. Studios looked at him and saw a guy who was too intense, too quiet, too hard to sell. He didn't schmooze. He didn't play the game. He'd rather sand a piece of walnut than shake hands at a party. And then in 1974, right in the middle of all that doubt, a letter showed up at his house, handwritten. No return address at first, just a name. Raymond Earl Harris, Rialto, California. Ford didn't know the name. He almost threw it away. But he opened it. And the letter was 3 pages long, written in the careful, deliberate handwriting of a man who wasn't used to writing letters, but had something important to say. Now, I can't quote the entire letter because it's never been fully released, but pieces of it have come out over the years through interviews with the Harris family, and here's the gist. Raymond Harris wrote to Harrison Ford because he'd seen him in American Graffiti, not in a theater. On a late-night TV broadcast, one of those early showings that networks did back then. Raymond had been up late because he couldn't sleep. His back was bothering him. He was 55 years old, working at a machine shop in San Bernardino, operating a lathe 8 hours a day, and his body was starting to tell him it was time to quit. But he couldn't quit. He had a mortgage, a wife, kids who still needed things, so he sat up in his recliner at 2 in the morning, watching a movie he'd never heard of, and he saw this young actor on screen, this guy playing Bob Falfa, and something about the performance stuck with him. Not because it was spectacular, not because Ford stole the movie, but because Raymond Harris recognized something in the way Ford carried himself on screen, a stubbornness, a refusal to be small. Raymond saw a guy who was fighting for every inch of screen time, a guy who knew he was the fifth or sixth most important person in the scene but refused to act like it, and Raymond connected with that, because that's how he felt at his job, that's how he felt in his life. He was a small man in a big world, doing a small job that nobody noticed, and he refused to be small about it. He took pride in his work. Every piece that came off his lathe was perfect, not because anyone was watching, because it mattered to him. Listen to me now. Raymond Harris sat down and wrote a letter to a carpenter/actor he'd never met, and told him something that nobody else in Hollywood was saying. He told Harrison Ford not to quit. The letter said, and I'm paraphrasing from what Tommy Harris later shared in a 2013 interview, "I don't know if you're going to make it in the movie business. I don't know anything about the movie business. But I watched you on my TV at 2 in the morning and I could tell you're not the kind of man who gives up. Whatever you're doing right now, whether it's acting or something else, you're doing it right. And I just wanted someone to tell you that. Because when I was your age, nobody told me. And I spent a lot of years wondering if I was wasting my time. I wasn't, and neither are you." Ford read that letter standing in his kitchen. His wife Mary later said he read it twice, set it down, picked it up and read it a third time. Then he folded it carefully and put it in his desk drawer. He didn't talk about it that night. He didn't talk about it for days. But Mary noticed something. He stopped talking about giving up acting. He'd been circling that idea for months, the idea of just going full-time into carpentry, building a real business, letting the Hollywood dream go. After that letter, he never brought it up again. Mark this moment. Understand what's happening here. A retired machinist from a town nobody visits wrote a letter to a struggling actor and told him to keep going. And the actor kept going. 1 year later, George Lucas called Harrison Ford to read lines with other actors auditioning for a little space movie called Star Wars. Ford wasn't auditioning. He was there to help. He was literally doing carpentry work on the door to Lucas's office. Lucas heard him read and thought, "Wait a minute, you know the rest." But here's the thing. Ford never wrote back to Raymond Harris. He kept the letter. He moved it from desk drawer to desk drawer over the years, house to house, through Star Wars, through the sequel, through Raiders, through all of it. But he never wrote back. And that fact ate at him. Stay with me, because this is where the timeline tightens. By 1982, Ford was dealing with something most people didn't know about. The fame was crushing him. Not in a dramatic Hollywood breakdown way, in a quiet, grinding way. He couldn't go anywhere. He couldn't be anonymous. He missed the simplicity of carpentry, the satisfaction of building something with his hands and walking away without anyone knowing his name. And in the back of his mind, always, was that letter from Raymond Harris. The letter from a man who understood what it meant to do good work in silence. The letter that had kept him in the game long enough for the game to find him. Ford had tried to find Raymond's address a couple of times over the years, but the original envelope had been lost in a move, and the name Raymond Harris isn't exactly uncommon. He'd let it go, told himself he'd get around to it. The way you tell yourself you'll call your old friend from college or visit your grandmother more often. Someday, always someday, and then someday ran out. In June of 1982, Ford's assistant at the time, a woman named Carolyn, was handling fan mail. Ford had mentioned the Raymond Harris letter to her once in passing, and Carolyn, being the kind of person who remembers things, had written the name down. She came across an obituary in a small California newspaper. Raymond Earl Harris, 63, of Rialto, survived by his wife Dolores, sons Thomas and Gary, daughter Linda. Funeral services Thursday. She brought the obituary to Ford. He was in the middle of prep work for Return of the Jedi. His schedule was packed. He had fittings, meetings, a flight to London in 4 days. She showed him the clipping and asked if this was the same man. Ford took the clipping. He read it. His jaw set. He stood up from his chair, walked to the window, and stood there for what Carolyn later described as a very long time. Then he turned around. "Cancel my afternoon. You have a meeting with the producers at 3. Cancel it." He drove himself. No driver, no assistant, no entourage. He rented a car because his own car was too recognizable, a detail that tells you everything about where his head was. He didn't want attention. He didn't want to be Harrison Ford, movie star. He wanted to be the guy who got that letter in 1974. And that brings us back to the cemetery. Tommy Harris holding the letter. Patricia reading over his shoulder. Ford standing there with his sunglasses off and his hands at his sides, completely exposed, the most famous face in America, in a cemetery full of people who had no idea why he was there. Tommy finished reading the letter. He looked up at Ford, and his eyes were wet. "My dad wrote this?" "He did. And you kept it all these years?" Ford nodded. "I should have written back. I never did. And I'm sorry about that." Tommy's chin trembled. He was a big man, thick-armed, weather-beaten, the kind of guy who probably hadn't cried in front of a stranger since he was a kid. But his chin trembled, and he pressed his lips together hard, and he looked down at the letter in his hands. Patricia put her hand on Tommy's back. She looked at Ford. "He never told us about this." "I'm not surprised," Ford said. He seemed like the kind of man who did things without needing credit for them. You could hear a pin drop on that grass. Tommy folded the letter carefully, the same way his father had folded it years before. He put it back in the envelope. And then he did something nobody expected. He held it out to Ford. "You keep it. It was yours." Ford shook his head. "It belongs with your family now." Tommy stared at him. Then he extended his other hand. Ford took it. They shook hands, and Tommy pulled him in for one of those brief, hard embraces that men do when words aren't enough. Now word was spreading through the small funeral crowd. People were murmuring. A couple of the grandchildren were openly staring. Someone had whispered Han Solo, and now everyone was trying to look without looking. But here's where Ford did something that elevated this whole thing from a nice gesture into something genuinely remarkable. He asked to meet Dolores. Tommy walked him over. Dolores Harris was sitting in a folding chair near the grave, a small woman in a black dress with her purse clutched in her lap. She looked up and saw this tall stranger approaching with her son, and she didn't recognize him. Not at first. Her eyes were swollen from crying. Her glasses were smudged. She was 70 years old, and she'd just buried her husband, and the world was a blur. Tommy knelt beside her. "Mom, this man knew Dad. He drove out from L.A. to pay his respects." Dolores looked at Ford. "You knew Raymond?" And here is the moment. Right here. Ford could have told her the whole story. Could have explained the letter, the timing, the impact it had on his career. Could have made it about himself, about Hollywood, about what her husband's words had meant to a future movie star. He could have given her a story to tell at dinner parties for the rest of her life. He didn't. He pulled up a folding chair, sat down next to her, and said 7 words. "Tell me about him. I want to listen." No one is satisfying their curiosity about Harrison Ford in that moment. There's no celebrity performance. There's no grand speech. There's a man sitting in a cheap folding chair asking a widow to talk about her husband. And Dolores talked. She talked for over an hour. She told Ford about how Raymond proposed to her at a county fair in 1940 with a ring he'd made himself from a piece of copper wire. She told him about the time Raymond drove 14 hours straight to bring Tommy home from a bad situation in Nevada, no questions asked. She told him about Raymond's workshop in the garage, how he'd spend Saturday mornings in there building birdhouses, little tables, toys for the grandkids, how he kept every tool organized and sharp and clean because he believed the way you treated your tools said everything about the way you treated your work. Ford listened. He asked questions, specific questions. What kind of wood did Raymond like? Did he use hand tools or power tools? What was his favorite thing he ever built? And Dolores answered every one, and for that hour she wasn't a grieving widow sitting in a cemetery. She was a woman remembering why she loved her husband. That matters. Trust me on that. At one point, Dolores mentioned that Raymond had always been quiet about his own feelings, that he wasn't the kind of man who said, "I love you" easily, but showed it through actions, through the things he built and fixed and carried. And Ford's face changed, just slightly. His eyes tightened. He looked down at his own hands, the hands that had gripped hammers and saws and chisels for years, and he said something so quiet that Dolores later told her daughter she almost missed it. "Your husband and I had that in common. No drama, no tears, no movie moment, just a fact, stated plainly, by a man who understood it in his bones." The funeral reception was at the Harris family home, a small house with a chain-link fence and a concrete driveway, and a detached garage that still smelled like sawdust. Ford was invited. He went. He stayed for 2 more hours. He ate potato salad off a paper plate. He talked to Gary, the younger son, about motorcycles. He let Michelle, the 12-year-old granddaughter who'd first recognized him, take a photograph with him using a disposable camera. He signed a paper napkin for Dolores's neighbor, an elderly man named Hector, who kept saying, "Indiana Jones is in my neighborhood," to anyone who would listen. And then Ford did one more thing before he left. He asked Tommy to show him Raymond's workshop. They walked into the garage together. It was exactly what you'd expect. Pegboard walls with tools hanging in precise order. A workbench with a vise, sawdust in the cracks of the concrete floor, cans of nails sorted by size, a half-finished birdhouse sitting on the bench, the last thing Raymond had been working on before he died. Ford ran his hand along the workbench. He picked up a hand plane, tested its weight, checked the blade. He set it down. He looked at the half-finished birdhouse. He was good, Ford said. Tommy was leaning against the door frame. "You know carpentry? I used to do it for a living." Tommy blinked. "You're kidding." "Before all the movies. I built cabinets, porches, studios. It's how I paid my bills." Tommy shook his head, almost laughing. Dad wrote a letter to a carpenter and didn't even know it. Ford looked at him, the corner of his mouth turned up just barely. Maybe he did know it. They stood there in silence for a moment, two men in a dead man's workshop, surrounded by the evidence of a life well built. Then Ford reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card. Not a Hollywood business card. His personal number, handwritten on a plain white card. "If your family ever needs anything." Tommy took the card. He nodded. Ford walked out of the garage, through the backyard, past the chain-link fence, and back to his rental car. He got in. He sat for a moment. Then he drove back to Los Angeles. And nobody talked about it. That's the part that still gets me. Nobody talked about it for years. The Harris family kept it quiet out of respect. They told close friends, sure. Tommy mentioned it at a barbecue once. Michelle showed the photograph to her classmates, but she was 12, and nobody believed her. Dolores kept the letter in a Bible by her bedside and read it once a year on Raymond's birthday. Ford never mentioned it publicly, not in interviews, not in his memoir work, not to journalists who asked him about fans, about his early days, about what kept him going during the lean years. He'd talk about carpentry. He'd talk about Lucas calling him to read lines. He'd talk about luck and timing and hard work. But he never mentioned Raymond Harris. For 30 years. It came out in 2012. Dolores had passed away in 2007, and the family decided they wanted to share the story. Tommy Harris did an interview with a local newspaper in San Bernardino. He told the whole thing. The letter, the funeral, the workshop, the 2 hours Ford spent listening to his mother talk about his father. The story got picked up by a few entertainment blogs. Then it hit social media. And suddenly, after 3 decades, people knew. But even then, Ford wouldn't talk about it. A reporter from a major outlet contacted his publicist. Ford's response was 4 words. It was a private matter. That's it. That's all he'd say. Now here's where I need you to sit with something. Think about what this means. Think about the timeline. In 1974, Harrison Ford was ready to quit acting. He was broke, discouraged, invisible. A stranger in Rialto, California, watched him on a fuzzy TV screen at 2 in the morning and recognized something real. That stranger sat down and wrote a letter that said, "Keep going. You're not wasting your time. You matter." Ford kept the letter. He kept going. He became one of the biggest movie stars who ever lived. Han Solo, Indiana Jones, Rick Deckard, Jack Ryan, roles that defined generations. And the letter stayed in his drawer, moving from house to house, a small folded piece of paper carrying the weight of a life that almost went a different direction. When the man who wrote that letter died, Ford dropped everything, canceled meetings, rented a car, drove to a cemetery in a town he'd never visited, stood in the back of a funeral for a man whose family didn't know why he was there, and when it was over, he didn't make a speech. He didn't announce himself. He sat in a folding chair and asked a widow to tell him about her husband. Because that's what Raymond Harris deserved. Not a celebrity appearance, not a grand gesture, just someone who cared enough to listen. And then Ford went home and didn't say a word about it for 30 years. If you've made it this far in the video, I need you to do something for me. Hit that subscribe button. Not because the algorithm demands it, not because I'm chasing numbers, but because stories like this one deserve to be told, and this channel is where they live. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. That's all I ask. Now let me tell you what happened after the story went public. Tommy Harris was overwhelmed by the response. He got calls from TV producers, journalists, documentary filmmakers. Everyone wanted to turn it into something. A movie, a special, a segment on the evening news. Tommy said no to all of it. "It's not a story about Harrison Ford," he told one producer. "It's a story about my dad," and he was right. Because here's the real turning point, the thing that shifts everything about this story if you let it. The hero isn't Harrison Ford. The hero is Raymond Earl Harris, a machinist from Rialto who worked a lathe for 35 years, built birdhouses on Saturday mornings, watered his lawn on Tuesday afternoons, and one night in 1974 sat down and wrote a letter to a stranger because he recognized something worth saving. Raymond never knew what that letter did. He never knew that the struggling actor he wrote to would become one of the most famous men alive. He never connected the guy from American Graffiti to the guy swinging a whip on a movie poster. He didn't write the letter for credit or recognition or a story to tell. He wrote it because he believed in what he said. Keep going. You're not wasting your time. That's the whole thing. That's the entire engine of this story. A single letter from a man who believed that encouragement is never wasted, even when you'll never know if it worked. And the fact that it did work, the fact that it may have saved one of the greatest film careers in history, is almost beside the point, because Raymond would have written that letter even if Ford had quit acting the next day. That's who he was. Michelle Harris, the granddaughter, grew up and became a teacher. She keeps a copy of her grandfather's letter framed on her classroom wall. Not the original. The original is with Tommy, but a photocopy, slightly faded, in a simple frame next to the whiteboard. And every September, on the first day of school, she tells her students the story. Not the Harrison Ford part, the Raymond Harris part. She tells them that her grandfather believed one person could change another person's life with nothing more than honesty and a postage stamp. And she asks each of her students to write a letter to someone they admire, someone they've never met, telling them what they see, telling them to keep going. I'm telling you right now, some of those letters have gotten responses. Not all, not most, but some. And every time a student gets a letter back, Michelle pins it to a bulletin board under a handwritten sign that says "Letters That Mattered." That bulletin board has been growing for 15 years. Ford found out about the bulletin board. Somebody told him, probably someone in the Harris family, though nobody's confirmed it. In 2015, Michelle received a package at her school. No return address. Inside was a handwritten note on plain paper. No letterhead, no logo, no Hollywood anything. The note said, "Dear Michelle, your grandfather told me not to quit. I didn't. Now you're telling a new generation not to quit. That's better than any movie I've ever made. Keep the letters going. With respect, HF." Michelle cried at her desk for 10 minutes. Then she pinned the note to the bulletin board. It's still there. Here's the final piece, the one that locks everything together. In 2018, Tommy Harris was cleaning out his mother's house, the house in Rialto, getting it ready to sell. He was in the garage, Raymond's old workshop, packing up tools, labeling boxes. And behind the pegboard, in a gap between the wall studs, he found a shoebox. Inside the shoebox were letters, dozens of them, all handwritten, all addressed to different people, actors, musicians, athletes, writers, people Raymond had watched on TV or read about in the newspaper, people he'd never met, people he thought needed to hear that someone noticed their work. There were letters to a minor league baseball player from Riverside, a folk singer who'd performed at the San Bernardino County Fair, a local news anchor, a high school wrestling coach, at least 40 letters, maybe more. Some had been sent based on the creases and missing envelopes. Some were still sealed, never mailed. Raymond had been writing these letters for decades. Ford wasn't the only one. He was just the most famous one. Tommy sat on the garage floor with that shoebox in his lap, and he finally understood his father in a way he never had while the man was alive. Raymond Harris wasn't a man who said, "I love you" easily. He showed it. Through birdhouses, through 14-hour drives to Nevada, through letters to strangers telling them their work mattered. The shoebox is with Michelle now. She's been tracking down the recipients, one by one, seeing if the letters made a difference. The minor league baseball player, it turned out, had kept his. He'd gone on to coach Little League for 26 years. He said he still had Raymond's letter in his wallet. This is not something I'm making up. This happened. So here's what I want to leave you with. Harrison Ford drove to a stranger's funeral in 1982 because he owed a debt he could never repay. He sat in a folding chair and listened to a widow talk about her husband because that was the only currency he had left. He couldn't write back. It was too late for that. But he could show up. He could sit down, he could listen, and he could keep a letter in his desk for the rest of his life as proof that the smallest gesture from the most ordinary person can change the trajectory of a life in ways that nobody sees coming. Raymond Earl Harris never made a movie, never wrote a book, never gave a speech. He ran a lathe, built birdhouses, watered his lawn, and wrote letters to people who needed them. And one of those letters might have given the world Indiana Jones. That is not a small life. That is a legacy. And every year, in a classroom in California, a teacher pins another letter to a bulletin board. And the board keeps growing. Some legends wear leather jackets and crack whips on a movie screen. Some legends wear work boots and write letters at 2 a.m. And if you're lucky, really lucky, you get to hear about both of them in the same story. This was one of those stories. And now it's yours.